In May of 2020, when videos circulated of two white men gunning down Ahmaud Arbery, who was jogging through his neighborhood, many Americans asked, how could this happen? Many of us vowed to never let it happen again. Hi, I'm Brian Brown, and this is my video series on structural racism for the East Hampton Public School District. Racism is our problem to fix, and we have to work together to fight against it. In order to fight against it, we have to understand it. Today's lecture is called Double Consciousness and Violence. And it asks the question of how is violence and the threat of violence used to prevent black people from exercising their rights as a citizen. So, in the last lesson, hopefully you watched it, we talked about Jim Crow and how after the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson, basically the federal government allowed for states to practice legal segregation. Facilities could be separate as long as they were equal. And this would last into the 1950s and 1960s. So last session's lesson was about legal segregation, whether it's people living apart, not being able to work the same jobs, eat in the same restaurants, go to the same schools, etc. It was also about legal, eventually ruled illegal, methods that were used to prevent black people from registering to vote. Poll taxes and literacy tests, which were only applied to black people who were trying to register to vote. This also kept black people off of juries. Through grandfather clause and through just selectively applying it or not applying it, white people were still allowed to vote even if they couldn't pay the poll tax or pass a literacy test. Okay, so today's lesson isn't subtle, but it does sort of point to the idea that not everything is about the law in America. A lot of it has to do with the way that we relate to each other. Okay, this is an extreme case of that. We're going to talk about violence. We're going to talk about intimidation. As I said, this is about violence, and it's also about the idea of double consciousness. Now, double consciousness is an idea that came from a pretty incredible American scholar named W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois, by the way, was born in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, so he's a local Western Mass guy, which is kind of awesome. Du Bois, it's impossible to sum up how important this guy was. He was a founding member of the NAACP. He wrote and published an enormous amount of books. I believe he was the first black man to get a PhD from Harvard. On and on. He was an advisor to political leaders in many countries. Incredible, towering figure. His most famous work, The Souls of Black Folk, published in 1897, still read in universities today. It's a very important sociological text. The main phrase that most people take away from it is that the problem of the 20th century in America is the problem of the color line. So this idea of double consciousness, all right, what does it mean? Well, in The Souls of Black Folk, so Du Bois was talking specifically about African Americans, about black people. Actually, he was talking about it in colonized people as well. It's this idea that you see yourself in two ways. That an oppressed person, a racially oppressed person, is always going to see themselves as they see themselves, but they're also going to see themselves through the lens of the oppressor, through the society that sees them as less than. All right? And it's impossible to view yourself as just yourself without also seeing it through the lens of how the powerful society is looking at you. Okay, so to apply double consciousness, it's sort of in the middle of a conversation here, all right? Last week we talked about this de jure segregation, this legal segregation. Society basically telling black Americans, you know, you're not as good as white people, you know, your kids can't play with our kids, you can't go to these schools, basically like the best of society, it's not for you. It doesn't matter how capable you are, it doesn't matter what your hopes and dreams are, you're never going to get beyond this point, all right? And society is going to keep it that way. So let's talk about the idea of violence and intimidation, okay? We're talking about preventing people, it's not just about where you can order a sandwich. This is about having economic equality and economic opportunity, educational equality, educational opportunity, all right? There are huge legal barriers and a huge psychological impact. Okay, by the way, the idea of double consciousness has now been applied beyond sort of race, beyond America to colonize people in general in the developing world. It's also being used by other marginalized people. Women, for example, are marginalized in most societies, and the idea that limitations that are put on women, the way that men who are in power see women, it's impossible for women not to see themselves through that as well. That's the idea of double consciousness. A term, I'm just going to throw in a bonus term for you if you don't know it, which also has to deal with this idea of double consciousness. Here's a term if you don't know it, which is code switching. Code switching isn't double consciousness, but code switching is the idea that people of color have to, there's how you act culturally around other people of color, and then you have to be able to also sort of speak the language of the dominant culture, to be able to engage in sort of the rules of that society. If you look at structural racism in education and stuff like that, code switching is one of the most important things to understand, because often what we designate as intelligence or the capability to succeed in society and so on and so forth is just how fluent people are in code switching, in the ability to sort of speak the language of the dominant culture. Okay, but I digress. All right, let's get back to the topic at hand. Okay, so if you've done a little bit of studying, if you've learned a little bit about the civil rights movement, okay, when I bring up violence and stuff like that, maybe you think of Birmingham, okay, and their pretty infamous Chief of Police Bull Connor. Maybe you've seen images from the Children's March in 1963 when the Southern Christian Leadership Coalition Conference, SCLC, Martin Luther King's organization, led a march in 1963. The police showed up with fire hoses, water cannons, and police dogs and unleashed them on peaceful protesters. Okay, maybe that's what comes to mind. All right, maybe you think of the 16th Street Baptist Church and the bombing that took place there in 1968. Okay, and maybe you know the story of Addie Mae Collins, age 14, Cynthia Wesley, age 14, Carol Robertson, age 14, Carol Denise McNair, 11, the four little girls who were killed when a Klansman set off a bomb in the 16th Street Baptist Church. That was the headquarters of the civil rights movement in Birmingham. The Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth was in charge of the Birmingham part of the movement, but people like Martin Luther King, Ralph Abernathy, and John Lewis. There are a ton of people there from different organizations who are all involved in it. Anyway, these 4 girls were killed by a bomb at a church. Maybe that's what you think of. Maybe you think of stuff like citizen violence against people doing sit-ins. So in 1960, in Greensboro, North Carolina, when the sit-in movement starts, where college students dressed up real nice and went into the Woolworth's lunch counter, sat down, just asked to order some food. And the townspeople showed up to attack them for doing that. Maybe you think, when you think of violence, of school desegregation in Boston in 1976. Maybe you've seen that iconic photo of a white teenager charging at a black civil rights lawyer who's being held with an American flag, about to stab him with the point of that American flag, from Boston in 1976. Okay, I said it in the last episode. I'll say it again. A lot of times, those of us up north, we're pretty judgmental about the South, and the South being especially racist and stuff. It's just a different kind of racism that they had in the South. The North is plenty racist, and Boston certainly takes its share of heat for that. But I will tell you, in the last episode, quick story. In the last episode, I talked about taking a literacy test in grad school, and so a woman who was in my group when we took the literacy test to try to pass, and we did. We passed it. She had grown up in Springfield, and she was a few years older than me. And in 1976, she was in middle school, what we would have called junior high back then. She's black, and she was being bused to Forest Park Middle School, which had been a white middle school. And when she and her friends from the neighborhood showed up and arrived at school that day, the first day of school, 1976, a bunch of white parents showed up, and they tried to turn the bus over. They were rocking the bus. And so she, as a 13, 14-year-old kid, right here in Springfield, Mass, we think of Western Mass as being extremely progressive politically and so on and so forth, sort of the bubble of the Happy Valley. This is a woman who's my age, my colleague, I believe she's still teaching. A bunch of adults showed up to try to turn over a bus that she as a child was in because she's black. All right? This is the kind of violence that I'm talking about, and it's impossible not to let this violence influence you. As a person, as a parent, okay? What a scary thing to send my kid off in a bus to school and know that there might be a bunch of adults who should know better, who are going to be violent against my kid. All right? That's going to make me think twice. It's going to make me wonder whether or not I should challenge this society. And this is where we get more into the subtlety of it, which is not subtle at all when there are adults trying to turn over a bus full of children. Okay. Now, in its most extreme form of violence, all right, the topic of lynching comes up. Lynching is an extrajudicial killing. Extrajudicial. All right. This is people who decide that they're going to kill somebody. People who make themselves judge, jury, and executioner. All right. Extrajudicial means that they haven't had a trial. They haven't had due process. And typically, when we think of the idea of lynching, we think of a hanging. And many lynchings were hangings. All right. Typically, again, the image that we have is of a black man who's been hanged by a lynch mob, all right, a group of white people who have decided that this person needs to be killed. And they're not going to wait for a trial, they're not going to wait for anything, they're just going to overpower this person and kill him. It wasn't always hanging, it wasn't always black men, but it often was. Yeah. So lynching is a topic that we're going to talk about. Now, a lot of times when people think of lynching, if you haven't studied lynching, if you don't know about it, then maybe you think that this is just a phenomenon that happened back during Reconstruction. Maybe it just happened in the 1800s, or maybe the early 1900s, but not in the 1930s, not in the 1950s, all right? Not in 2020, all right? But remember that a lynching is an extrajudicial killing. It's a couple people overpowering somebody and deciding that that person deserves to die for something that they're perceived to have done. Okay, we're going to talk about in the next episode is about white supremacy and some of the myths of white supremacy, and we'll come back to some of the myths that society perpetuates to justify things like lynching. We'll talk about that next time. Okay, but while I have you listening and thinking about lynching for a second, I want to make a point, and that this is a point that I think it's a good point. I want you to try to remember it. Okay, democracy is something that we as Americans, we really, really value. We latch onto it. We know it's important. All right, and we swear by democracy. If you hear popping in the background, it's the 4th of July right now, right? I couldn't be more excited about democracy. There's somebody setting off fireworks, okay? But democracy isn't enough, all right? Because there's always going to be somebody who is outvoted, and that person might be right. That person might be in a very vulnerable situation, all right? And so it's the goal of society to preserve democracy, but it's also important to protect people, all right, who are in the minority in any sort of vote, all right? And so I want you to sort of remember this phrase. I like this phrase, all right? Democracy without equality is a lynch mob, all right? A lynch mob is completely demographic, all right? There were 3 white guys who decided that Ahmaud Arbery should die because he was jogging through their neighborhood and he was black. And they chased him down and they shot him. It was very democratic. 3-1 vote. Okay? Democracy is essential, but democracy without equality, democracy without protection, all right? That's just a lynch mob. That's just ganging up on people. All right? Just thought I'd put that thought in your heads. We got to protect people. So, America and lynching, it's a very old story. It's a very sad story. Lynchings used to be public events sometimes, all right? They sold postcards of public hangings and things like that. A resource, if you're interested in learning about lynching, that I highly recommend is this book, Without Sanctuary, Lynching Photography in America. It's edited by James Allen. This is lynching photography. It's horrific. All right, it is unsettling. It's horrible. All right, you're going to wonder why you looked, but it's important to know that this is a big part of our history and that this wasn't just a small thing. It wasn't just a thing from the 1800s that's long since gone. All right, maybe a resource that you are familiar with from 1939. And that would be the song Strange Fruit by Billie Holiday. All right. So in 1939, Billie Holiday recorded this song Strange Fruit, and it's about lynching and the idea the strange fruit that's hanging from the trees are black men. It's a very, very powerful song. It's an incredible performance. If you haven't listened to any Billie Holiday, you should. She's awesome. Okay, now this song was actually written by a guy by the name of Abel Meeropol. Abel Meeropol, a pretty interesting guy in a lot of ways, but he wrote the lyric. He wrote the melody. I don't know to what extent Billie Holiday improved on the melody or not. Her performance is incredible, regardless. But this is something you should check out. By the way, any fans of Kanye's album Yeezus, this song is referred to in the song Blood on the Leaves, which is a line right from the poem. Quick just mention about Abel Meeropol is that students of history might know about Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were tried, convicted, and executed for selling American nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. They had two sons who were adopted by the Meeropol family. And so not only that, but I believe one or both of them still live locally in Western Mass. One of them actually taught at Western New England. So anyway, a little bit more local history. Another shout out to the 413. I can't find where I put my sign. Okay, probably the most famous lynching, I would say, would be Emmett Till. Emmett Till was 14 years old. He was from Chicago, and he was spending the summer with his, I believe, with his great uncle down in Money, Mississippi. And what's interesting is we don't really know exactly what happened. Somehow, Emmett Till spoke to or gave a white woman the idea that he was acting inappropriately. We would later find out that that she made up a lot of what she said he did. I think she said he whistled at her. You can see stories that maybe he put his hands on her, something like that. It's pretty clear that he did none of those things. But for whatever slight social transgression he supposedly did, Emmett Till was taken in the middle of the night from his relative's house by three men. He was beaten. He was shot in the head. Wrapped up in like a carpet, like with an air conditioner, something heavy. They threw him in the Tallahatchie River, and they didn't find his body for a few days. That story, there's probably a million stories like that from the South. All right. The reason that we know about Emmett Till is because when they did get him out of the river and stuff like that, Emmett Till's mom had a funeral for Emmett, and she had an open casket. Emmett Till was beaten severely about the head and face. He was shot in the head, and then he spent several days submerged in a river. For his mom to have an open casket funeral makes a very clear statement, an incredibly clear statement, and the statement is this: this is what they did to my son, my 14-year-old son. All right, for violating some unspoken code of the South. All right, Emmett Till didn't practice the double consciousness to the extent that he was able to keep himself alive. He somehow he didn't see his actions through the eyes of the white people who would murder him. Right? It's not Emmett Till's fault. It's not Emmett Till's fault at all. He shouldn't have to understand some unspoken crazy set of rules for expectations about how low he should keep his gaze or who he should talk to and who he should not. Okay? And he was murdered for it. So not only did Emmett Till's mom have an open casket funeral, but she had it in a huge cathedral in Chicago, and it became this thing where just hundreds and hundreds of people came through, paid their respects, and Jet magazine, which was a large format. If you're familiar with Life magazine was a large format magazine that was about photojournalism. So some of us might remember it from when we were kids. It doesn't really exist per se anymore. Jet magazine, they took a photograph, a close-up of Emmett Till's face in his casket, and it was a twofold picture in the center of the magazine. This picture of Emmett Till's face. All right, and that was meant to confront the idea of lynching, the idea of violence. Now, it doesn't have to be murder. It doesn't even have to be a violent act, just the threat of violence, just the mention that, hey, what you're saying might be a little out of place, you might want to rethink that. The suggestion of violence is all that's needed to force black people in the South not to aim too high, not to aspire for things, certainly not to think about something like registering to vote if they could pass the literacy test, as many people I'm sure could, as they could pay the poll tax, as some people could. All right, you still don't register to vote because you might end up being the victim of violence. All right, now the most infamous organization that's involved with violence and intimidation, of course, is the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. All right, which is still in existence today. All right, and so there are many organizations. There are many organizations of intimidation and racial discrimination and so on and so forth. In America, the Klan is the most famous. All right. Now, just a quick look at the Klan before I sign out here. The Klan has really three main eras that they are active. Okay. First of all, they exist during Reconstruction, and they come about to intimidate people from exercising their rights. This is a time when people actually could exercise their rights. They were there. This is a white secret organization meant to intimidate people from trying to be equal in society. All right. Now, 1915 is an interesting time because there's this huge uptick in Klan activity. This coincides with a very famous, as far as film history goes, movie called Birth of the Nation by D.W. Griffith. And it's in every sort of film history book and so on and so forth. It was very important cinematically as a feature film and how they shot it, blah, blah, blah. But the film is about the Klan, and it's this re-imaging of Reconstruction in the eyes of that the South were these poor victims of the North, and that there were these predatory, violent, and unintelligent black people who were now preying on people. A lot of this will come up in the white supremacy episode, which is coming next. Okay, but that movie made a whole bunch of people want to join the Klan, and the Klan had this huge uptick at that point. This is also the time, by the way, 1915, 1920s and stuff like that, when you see this huge upsurge in the Confederate monuments that we see in America today. After all, you wouldn't be building them after the Civil War. The Confederates lost the Civil War. So the period after the Civil War, they're not building monuments to people who had an uprising against the government. That doesn't make sense. It's during this time where the Klan is getting a lot of support, and people are sort of reimagining what they think the Civil War was about. This idea of states' rights and this idea of other things that it wasn't about. States' rights to have slavery, sure. All right. The big upswell that will be relevant for what we're going to be talking about in the next couple episodes is during the Civil Rights Movement. The Klan has another huge gain in popularity. And this is where we start seeing the Confederate flag, the battle flag of Northern Virginia, the stars and bars. You all know what I mean when I say the Confederate flag. This is where we start seeing this flying over government buildings and people using it as a symbol to intimidate African Americans in the South and to remind them that people fought a war over keeping them down, and they'll do it again. Hopefully they won't. Okay. Anyway, so next time we're going to talk about the idea of the concept of white supremacy and how that permeates our culture. There's going to be some more about the Civil Rights Movement. We're going to be in the Civil Rights Movement for a while. This is interesting stuff. So anyway, I want you to thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Thank you.